Okay, good morning. On behalf of Operation Rock, I am Clayton here with another great broadcast. Forgive me, I know I've been out for a while. I've been out at least like 2 or 3 weeks. I got a bunch of stuff going on in my personal life, but God is good. So the best thing I can say is that I'm expanding. I'm growing as a person. Forgive me. I always got to do these setting things every time I get on this for some reason. I have no clue why. Why is this not doing what it needs to do? Okay, there it goes, people. I have no clue why it wasn't working, but it looks like we're good. Just give me 1 second to figure this out. I got to figure this out because it does it every time, people. I don't understand why it does that to me. Every time I go, it's like my security settings automatically makes this thing private as soon as I get on. So here we go. On behalf of Operation Rock, I am Clayton here with a hopefully very informative broadcast regarding the origins of your local police department. Now, why am I here talking about the origins of the local police? Well, it kind of began for me. It's been a problem my whole life. I'll be honest with you. I am a minority male. Unfortunately, as a minority male, I have had encounters with the law. Now, I'm not going to say on and during all of those encounters they were unjustified. Um, in my younger years, I was less wise. I did a lot of stupid things. Sometimes I made mistakes that I ultimately ended up having to answer for, such as life. But on many occasions, I know definitively that I was targeted and selectively used by law enforcement to obtain objectives. And it's just a harsh reality of growing up in urban neighborhoods. You are targeted for police for purposes of prosecution and arrest. Law enforcement is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It supports families, it supports people's college tuition, it supports retirement funds. So people have to go through the natural course of a career in order to reap those benefits, take care of their family, etc. The only way to do that is to keep the system going, and how they keep the system going, unfortunately, is to keep pumping things into it, sometimes unnecessarily. Um, I began my journey in civil rights probably about 3.5, 4 years ago, as many people know who have been watching me. It all started out with me having an ex-girlfriend who was stalking me and was using vexatious and false litigation to obtain revenge against me for a failed relationship. Now, sometimes in life, many times in life, women are able to control the narrative through intelligence, through beauty, through manipulation. And in controlling narratives, they pretend and position themselves as victims when in truth they are actually offenders. And we see this all the time. We see if we look at a lot of cases in society, we'll see situations. Excuse me, it's something on my screen that's really annoying me. You'll see situations where women are 100% guilty in one respect, but they'll use any negative aspect of their personal domestic relationship to shield themselves from liability of anything that happened during the relationship. You hear situations where men and women together kill people, and the woman will position herself as a victim by saying the man was domestically abusive to her, but the truth is she was a co-conspirator. You hear situations where women are selling drugs with men. They get caught with the men. What they do, they blame it all on the man. Oh, he made me do this. He was in control, whatever. It's kind of similar to the convict's tale in prison. I didn't do it. Same thing with women. Sometimes you do have situations where women are put in positions where they're manipulated, but the majority of the time they are not. The unfortunate problem is that law enforcement is predisposed to automatically believe the word of women. And I don't want to say that in all cases, but I definitely want to say it in terms. I definitely want to talk about it in terms of criminal and family court matters. Um, the American justice system is one where we are supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. Justice is supposed to be blind. The scales are supposed to be balanced. This is why we see all of these famous logos and images that represent the United States court system. But the truth is, the United States court system, although the Constitution may have been designed with fairness in mind, the United States court system and legal system was not based on that. The United States court system and the current legal system is really based off of law enforcement's transition after the Civil War. Now, what transition am I talking about? What I am talking about is the transition from the slave patrols of the Southern South. pre-Civil War to the modern day policing that we have now. Modern day policing directly descends from the slave patrols of the Confederate South. It's a historical fact. And today, what I'm going to do, considering that I'm doing all of this work to go into a new profession and I had to actually do some research on this, is I'm going to present to you today, factually, how your modern police department began. It did not begin because some wise people wanted to keep law enforcement and rule of law and the rule of order in your town, municipality, whatever it might be underway. That's actually not how police departments started. Police departments started as a direct transition from slavery. And we're going to talk about that today. Instead of me rambling and going on, I think we'll take a more structured approach and we'll just get right into it. Because again, people, I believe this is important. It may not be like this everywhere in the world, but unfortunately, it's like that in the United States. We're minorities. And I don't want to say particularly Black people, because doing the research and actually doing the legwork, I see that it's far greater than Black people. It's really all minorities. Any smaller class, any class that's unfavorable to law enforcement in a situation where an arrest can be made, they will marginalize you and they will completely violate your civil rights. It just happens. It's nothing you can do about it because the racism and bias of law enforcement is systemically placed within the system. There's absolutely nothing we can do without it. It's so rooted in the history of this country. It's just something we have to accept. But you can't choose to fight like an animal. You have to learn how to fight like a gentleman, because that's the only way you're going to win. Any other way, you feed right into the system of incarceration, which is what they want you to be, because this is how they funnel themselves. So without further ado, we're going to begin, and we're going to talk about how your local police department really started. Mm, I think I like this view better. I'm going to go that way. Okay. I actually don't like that view better, people. We're going to go back to view one. That's better. Okay. The agenda we're going to go to today is the origin of the slave patrol, the collapse of slavery, the transition into formal policing, northern and urban policing, and the legacy of slave patrols in modern policing. Slave patrols were among the earliest forms of organized law enforcement in the American South. These patrols were designed explicitly to enforce the institution of slavery by controlling the movements and behaviors of enslaved people. Slave patrols were first established in South Carolina in 1704 and later became widespread across the southern states. These patrols were often composed of white men, including lower class farmers who had a vested interest in maintaining slavery as an institution. Participation was often required by law, making them an official state sanctioned force. If you notice, what is your police? Your local police department is a state sanctioned force. It may be controlled by your municipality, but they have the backing of the state of whatever state you're in, the police have the backing of that state. Capture the primary responsibilities of slave patrols included capturing runaway slaves. Slave patrols were responsible for finding and returning enslaved people who attempted to escape. Preventing slave riots. Patrols sought to deter rebellion by instilling fear through violence and surveillance. So if you think about it, people, your local police department, what do? They make rounds to allegedly round up criminals and return them to order. And if there's any kind of public disturbance they don't like, think about it, people. If you have let's say, a disturbance about the Ukraine, Iran, what's the first thing that happens? Your local police shows up in riot gear with shields and masks and pepper spray. Think about it, people. This is the origins of where they come from. Enforcing slave codes. These codes prohibited enslaved people from assembling in groups, learning to read or write, or traveling without permission. Punishing suspected rule violators. Slave patrols had the opportunity to search slave quarters, question Black families, both enslaved and free, and administer beatings or other punishments without trial. People, this sounds really similar to what your local police department does, let's say, when they want to get into your home, if they believe that you are selling drugs. More lately, I can say so than the past. Now they'll definitely make sure they have a warrant. But people, they do so much dirty stuff to get into your home. People, this sounds just like the local police to me, at least where I'm from, because I'm from New York. Major causes of the collapse of slavery. The collapse of slavery in the United States was driven by multiple factors, including economic shifts, political conflicts, moral opposition, and ultimately military force. The eventual collapse in the United States did not occur overnight, but resulted from a long series of developments spanning decades. Economic changes and industrialization, declining economic viability of slavery in some regions. While slavery was immensely profitable in the southern states, particularly for cotton plantation, it was becoming less economically viable in the north. By the early 19th century, industrialization in the North led to a shift towards wage labor, which was seen as more efficient than slavery in a growing capitalist economy. Many northern states abolished slavery in the late 18th century and early 19th century, reducing its economic significance outside the South. Northern economic growth versus Southern dependence on slavery. The Industrial Revolution, the 18th century and early 19th century, created new economic models based on factories, railroads, and mechanized agriculture, which did not rely on enslaved labor. The South, however, remained dependent on a plantation economy, which required enslaved labor for cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and sugar. As the Northern and Western economies expanded, slavery became more of a regional institution rather than isolating the South. Religious groups, particularly Quakers, Methodists, Baptists, played a major role in anti slavery advocacy. Prominent abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, William Lloyd Garrison, and Sojourner Truth raised awareness of the brutality of slavery. We all remember the Underground Railroad, Frederick Douglass's speech. This is Sojourner Truth. These are all lessons we learned in school, even though they definitely constructed them and tailored them to how they wanted us to remember. Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, became one of the most influential anti slavery books, exposing the cruelty of the system to a mass audience. Anti slavery newspapers such as The Liberator, published by Garrison, spread abolitionist ideas and highlighted tensions between the North and the South. A secret network that helped enslaved people escape to the North in Canada, led by figures like Harriet Tubman, was the Underground Railroad. Southern slaveholders saw it as an attack on their way of life, increasing sectional animosity. What that basically just means is the Southern people got upset because the Northerns were accepting freed slaves. The slaves that escaped from the South were being accepted by the North, increasing tensions between the North and the South because the North wouldn't in turn return the slaves. The expansion of slavery into new territories. Missouri Compromise of 1820 allowed Missouri to enter as a slave state while Maine entered as a free state. It drew a line at the 3630 latitude, restricting slavery expansion into the state of Louisiana. The Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act allowed California to enter as a free state, but strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, which required the return of escaped slaves to their owners. Made slavery a national issue by forcing free states to comply with Southern demands. Basically, if you had a slave from the South and someone found out that it was in your residence in the North, or you knew this person, they lived in your building, you had an obligation by law to return this slave, or you were violating law. That was the Fugitive Slave Act. Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and Bleeding Kansas allowed territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, leading to violent conflict between pro and anti-slavery forces. So basically, because of the Nebraska-Kansas Act, it allowed states to choose for themselves, and people who were pro-slavery and anti-slavery kind of went to war with each other in these local towns and municipalities. So it was a divisionary tool, demonstrated that slavery was no longer just as a Southern issue, but a national crisis. The difference between free and slave states. Before the Civil War, the United States was divided between free and slave states based on their stance on slavery. Free states, primarily located in the North, had abolished slavery and prohibited its practice within their borders, often advocating for its containment and eventual abolition nationwide. In contrast, slave states, mainly in the South, legally permitted slavery and relied on enslaved labor as a fundamental part of their economic and social systems, particularly in agriculture. This division fueled sectional tension, leading to conflicts over new territories, states' rights, and ultimately contributing to the outbreak of the Civil War, which began in 1861. The Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act, originally passed in 1793 and strengthened in 1850, was a federal law that required the return of escaped slaves, individuals to their enslavers, even if they had reached free states. The 1850 version, part of the Compromise of 1850, was particularly harsh, mandating that federal officials and citizens assist in the capturing of fugitive slaves and imposing severe penalties on those who aided their escape. It denied alleged victims the right to a jury trial and led in legal representation, leading to a widespread abuses, including kidnapping of free black individuals into slavery. The law intensified sectional tensions, fueling Northern resistance and strengthening the abolitionist movement, ultimately pushing the nation closer to civil war. Sectionalism is the intense loyalty and identification with one's own region or section of a country rather than the country as a whole. In the United States before the Civil War, sectionalism was primarily driven by economic, social, and political differences between the North and South. The North was with its industrial economy opposed the expansion of slavery, while the agrarian South depended on enslaved labor and sought to protect and expand it. These conflicting interests led to growing political divisions, disputes over states' rights, and ultimately contributed to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. Why does that feel deja vu? The South secedes. After Lincoln's election, South Carolina was the first state to secede, December 1860, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas. In 1861, these states formed the Confederate States of America, the CSA, with Jefferson Davis as the president. While the Union initially fought to preserve the nation, slavery was the fundamental cause of the war. The Confederacy explicitly stated its founding documents that its government was built on white supremacy and slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation after the Battle of Antietam, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free. This shifted the war's focus from preserving the Union to abolishing slavery. Union victory and the 13th Amendment. The North's industrial and military superiority led to Confederate defeat in April of 1865. The 13th Amendment, ratified December 1865, officially abolished slavery throughout the United States. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to assist formerly enslaved people with education, employment, and land ownership. Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment of 1865 abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment of 1868 granted citizenship to Black Americans. The 15th Amendment of 1870 gave Black men the right to vote, and Black political participation increased, with formerly enslaved people holding political office for the first time. The rise of white supremacy and Jim Crow's law. Southern backlash led to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, and violent repression of Black political power. By the late 19th century, Jim Crow laws were enacted enforcing segregation and racial discrimination. Economic exploitation of Black Americans, many freed men, became sharecroppers, locked in cycles of debt that closely resembled slavery. Convict leasing allowed Southern states to imprison Black men for minor offenses and force them into unpaid labor. So that is the origins, people, of your local prison industry. It originates from the Jim Crow South. When they created these laws, the Jim Crow laws, the Black Code, whatever you want to call it, to have recently freed slaves incarcerated and to be put to work for slave labors. Due to a loophole, I believe it is, in the, I forgot, I think it's not the 11th Amendment because that's immunity. It might actually be, it might be the 11th Amendment. I don't remember, but we won't get into that right now. The fight for full civil rights continued through the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, leading to landmark victories like Brown versus the Board of Education, huge case in 1954 that ended school segregation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, and it actually made black people in general, a protected class. Voting Rights Act of 1965 ended literacy tests and other barriers to black voting. Modern day racial equality. Mass incarceration, economic disparities, and systematic racism have roots in slavery's legacy. Police brutality, voter suppression, and racial wealth gaps are seen as extensions of past racial oppression. The big part about talking about what started the Civil War is discussing Nat Turner and his revolution. Nat Turner, 1800 to 1831, was an enslaved African American preacher who led one of the most significant slave rebellions in U.S. history. Born in Southampton County, Virginia, Turner was deeply religious and believed he was chosen by God to free his people from bondage. He may have been right, because if he had known what his actions would have caused, he probably did. That's what he means by he was chosen by God. Forgive me, people. Known for his intelligence, literacy, and spiritual visions, Turner's leadership and charisma made him a respected figure among enslaved people. The Rebellion of 1831. By the early 19th century, slavery had become increasingly oppressive, especially in the Deep South. Enslaved people faced harsh conditions, including brutal punishments for minor infractions, limited mobility, and increased restrictions following earlier failed rebellions. E.g., examples given: Gabriel Poser's 1800 plot and Denmark Vesey's 1822 conspiracy. Religious inspiration, as Turner and many enslaved people interpreted the Bible as a call for liberation. Turner claimed to have divine visions instructing him to lead an uprising against slaveholders. He saw a solar eclipse and atmospheric disturbances as a sign from God that the time for the rebellion had come. Turner and his followers launched their rebellion on August 21st of 1831, beginning with the murder of Turner's enslaver, Joseph Travis, and his family. Armed mostly with knives, axes, and farm tools, Turner and about 70 enslaved and freed black men moved from plantation to plantation in Southampton County, Virginia, killing slaveholders, their families, and overseers. Key events of the rebellion. Turner and his men killed 55 to 65 white people, including women and children. The rebels gained new recruits as they moved through the countryside. They attempted to seize Jerusalem, Virginia, now Cortland, but were confronted by white militias and armed civilians. After 2 days, the rebellion was crushed when state and federal troops, along with armed white militias, overpowered the rebels. Most of Turner's men were captured or killed within a few days, but Turner himself evaded capture for over 2 months, hiding in the woods. On October 30th, 1831, Turner was finally captured. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. On November 11th of 1831, he was hanged and then skinned, with his body parts reportedly distributed as macabre souvenirs among white residents. His skull and other remnants were said to have been kept as relics for years. Before his execution, Turner was interviewed by attorney Thomas R. Gary, who published The Confessions of Nat Turner, a document that provides insight into Turner's motivations and beliefs. The rebellion terrified white Southerners, who feared that more enslaved people would rise up. Their response was brutal, widespread, and deeply racist. In the immediate aftermath, white militias and mobs killed over 100 to 200 black people, many of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion. Some black men, women, and children were tortured and mutilated before being executed. In some cases, enslaved people were burned alive, decapitated, or hanged from trees in acts of racial terror. Harsher slave laws. White lawmakers enacted stricter laws to prevent future revolts. These included banning black literacy. It became illegal for enslaved people and sometimes even free people to learn to read or write, as literally was seen as a tool for rebellion. Like they say, people, knowledge is power. And how do you want to keep someone dumb? Keep their head out of a book. Increased surveillance and patrols. Slave patrols became more aggressive, monitoring black communities more closely. Restriction on black religious gatherings. Since Turner was a preacher, white authorities banned unsupervised black worship services, fearing that rebellious teachings could inspire resistance. Limiting movement. Enslaved people were no longer allowed to travel without direct supervision. White communities lived in fear of future revolts, even though most enslaved people had no real ability to rebel. Some white families fled the South, fearing further insurrections. Even free black people faced greater restrictions, with some being re enslaved or deported from southern states. Southern politicians and intellectuals doubled down on their defense of slavery, claiming that enslaved people were inherently violent and that slavery was necessary to maintain social order. Religious justifications for slavery expanded, with slave owners arguing that they were civilizing black people and that the rebellion proved the necessary to slavery. The long-term effects of the rebellions: increased tensions between the North and the South. The harsh response to Turner's rebellion hardened divisions between abolitionists in the North and pro-slavery Southerners. Northern abolitionists cited Turner's revolts as evidence that slavery was unsustainable and morally wrong, while Southern leaders insisted that more repression was needed. Turner's revolt inspired other enslaved people despite the violent backlash. Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists later cited Turner as an example of justified resistance. Turner became a symbol of Black resistance and self determination, influencing later movements like the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. The violent white response to Turner's rebellion foreshadowed the rise of white supremacist terror groups like the KKK after the Civil War. Many of those laws passed after the rebellion remained in effect for decades, reinforcing systemic racism. Nat Turner's name remained controversial, with many in the South demonizing him as a bloodthirsty murderer, while others saw him as a hero for the Black liberation. After the Civil War and the rebellion of slavery in 1865, many former slave patrol members became part of new law enforcement bodies, particularly in the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras. These early police forces enforced Black codes, laws designed to restrict the freedom of newly freed Black people, participated in racial violence and suppression, often collaborating with groups like the KKK, and maintained racial and social hierarchies through vagrancy laws and convict leasing systems. With the passage of the 13th Amendment of 1865, slavery was formally abolished, but the social order built around white supremacy remained intact. In response, Southern states quickly developed new laws and institutions to maintain racial control. The Black Codes of 1865 to 1866. Immediately after the emancipations, many Southern states enacted Black Codes, which were laws designed to restrict the freedom of Black people and ensure their availability as a labor force. These laws criminalized vagrancy, requiring Black people to prove employment or risk arrest, prohibited Black people from carrying weapons or assembling in groups, limited Black people's ability to travel freely, established harsh labor contracts that bound freedmen to white employers. These laws were enforced by police forces that were direct successors to the slave patrols. The transition was so seamless that in many areas, the same individuals who served as slave patrolmen became law enforcement officers. The KKK and law enforcement collaboration. During the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, white supremacist groups like the KKK worked alongside local police to terrorize Black civilians and prevent them from exercising their new rights. Many sheriffs and police officers either ignored Klan violence or actively participated in it. Jim Crow era and the institutionalism of racial policing, 1877 to 1965. After Reconstruction ended in 1877, Jim Crow laws were enacted across the South, codifying racial segregation and discrimination. Law enforcement played a critical role in upholding these laws through arresting black individuals for minor offenses. Many black men were arrested on dubious charges such as loitering or violating segregation laws and then forced into convict leasing, a system that re enslaved them through prison labor. Brutalizing civil rights activists. Police departments used excessive force to suppress protests during the civil rights movements. Examples given: the use of attack dogs, fire hoses in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. Failing to protect black communities from lynchings. Local police forces often refused to intervene in lynchings or actively participated in them. By this time, policing had become a formalized institution, but it it continued to operate with many of the same racial control functions as the slave patrols. Forgive me. Northern and urban policing. While the South's policing roots are closely tied to the slave patrols, Northern policing departments had different origins. Many were formed in the 19th century in response to urbanization, crime, labor unrest, and the need for social control. However, even these forces disproportionately targeted marginalized communities, including immigrants and free black people. Urban Early urban policing, mid 19th century. In cities like New York, Boston, and Philly, formal police departments were established in the mid 19th century in response to labor unrest, crime, and political instability. These forces were heavily involved in suppressing working class uprisings, particularly among immigrants and black communities. The Great Migration and racial policing. During the Great Migration, 1916 to 1970, millions of black Americans moved from South to northern cities. Police in these cities use racial profiling, over policing, and brutality to contain black communities. Practices like stop and frisk and the enforcement of redlining policies reinforce segregation and economic inequality. Although policing has evolved over centuries, many modern practices still reflect the legacy of racial control that began with slave patrols. Key connections: over policing of black communities. Just as slave patrols targeted enslaved people, modern policing disproportionately focuses on black neighborhoods through excessive policing tactics. Examples given: stop and frisk, broken windows, policing, TNT, jump out boys, whatever you want to call it. Mass incarceration and criminalization of black people. The war on drugs, the 1970s to present, led to the disproportionate incarceration of black men, often for minor offenses. The prison industry complex has been compared to convict leasing and slavery and economic exploitation of labor. And that's a whole nother video, people, because the war on drugs was never really a war. It was this country's way of fueling external activities in Latin America. It had nothing to do with the war on drugs. They actually brought them into the country. High-profile cases of police brutality, examples given: Rodney King, George Floyd, reflect a long-standing pattern of law enforcement using excessive force against black people. The justification for such force often mirrors past narratives used to control enslaved people, including claims of resisting arrest and being inherently dangerous. And that's usually the truth, people. Every time you're a black man and you deal with cops, you can show no anger, you can show no emotion. You're not allowed to be human because they really consider you animals from, I would say, the systemic training that they were given since the slave patrols. You can't get angry as a black man. If you get angry, you're resisting arrest. That's just the truth. Militarization of the police force. Modern SWAT teams and riot control tactics mirror the violent enforcement methods used by slave patrols and Jim Crow era police forces. The use of military grade equipment is predominantly black neighborhoods, reflects historical fears of black rebellion. But actually, I got to speak in defense of that too, because sometimes in some hoods, if guys is really getting money, they do be having some weapons. The police need them. In conclusion, while modern police departments are complex institutions with multiple influences, there is undeniably historical continuity between Southern slave patrols and modern policing tactics, particularly in how they relate to race. The core function of controlling and criminalizing Black people has persisted through the transition from slave patrols to post Civil War law enforcement, the enforcement of Black codes and Jim Crow laws into modern day drug enforcement laws and criminal code, and the disproportionate targeting of Black communities in the 20th and 21st century. This history is critical to understanding why racial disparities in policing persist today, and why calls for police reform or abolition often refluence the deep-seated historical injustices. Wow, it must be early. I'm slow. Thank you. Okay, so let's get out of this and let's talk about what it is. Hmm. All right, how do I do that? I don't know. You gotta figure it out, people. Shit. Maybe that's it. Is that it? No, that's not it. Okay. Messing up bad today, people. It's all good. I got it. I'm gonna figure it out. Just give me 1 second. Bam. There we go. All right. We don't need a media source. We don't want one. Blow me up. That's how you can tell people I haven't been using this. I forgot how to use the damn platform. So I had to actually do this for a political science class I'm taking. I had to kind of do this for a paper. So I summarized it into that brief, 30-minute presentation to basically give you a factual history of what your northern and southern police departments transitioned from. And this includes the entire country because the police departments of the South and the North migrated west towards LA, California, Texas. It's really just the same thing. It's just worse in some places. Um, I remember in the beginning of my civil rights journey, I screamed racism a lot, but I didn't really understand now as much then as I do now why that really was. And the truth of the matter is it is racism. It's systemic racism that really just begins from when this all began after the post Civil War. Um, I was angry with a lot of people. I was angry with a lot of with law enforcement, but I realized they can't help themselves. This is just what they are. They really can't help the fact that they do these things with regard to the violation of Black men, not thinking we have civil rights, not thinking we deserve the equal protection of law, not feeling we have the right to raise our children without their interference. This is just what it is because it's all a control factor. It's all a control mechanism, excuse me. So without keep stuttering and saying because I'm looking at the time and I have to go, on behalf of Clayton and Operation Rock, I hope this was informative. And we are going to be back more. I'm just in class, people, so I'm doing a lot. I have another situation going on that I'm kind of dealing with. And I've been asked to kind of keep a low profile to a certain extent for a while, so I have to deal with that. But that should be over in about 90 days. I hope to speak about that because that's relevant to domestic violence. And I have just uncovered a real issue, people, with how law enforcement tends to treat men when women make allegations. A man can make an allegation against a woman, people, and it's nothing unless it's violent, something physically violent where she has to go to jail. I'll give the police that. They will do nothing. They will do whatever they can, law enforcement, prosecutors, to I want to say bolster a woman's victimhood while diminishing the man's right to a fair process and even victimhood himself if he may be the victim. I currently know a situation with a guy who's probably going to be in jail for the rest of his life, which is really sad. But the truth of the matter is, he shouldn't be in jail for the rest of his life because he's what he's being accused of. And even if they want to say he should go to prison for the rest of his life, which is a possibility, um, as someone who intimately knows this situation, I totally think that his woman should go to jail too, because I know she's just as guilty as him. And I've tried to tell this to some pretty important people who will not listen. So this is something I'm dealing with now that I hope it works out the right way. That's all I'm saying. Because I don't believe anyone should pay for something that they really are not fully responsible for. If you do something with someone who's fully aware of what they're doing, they shouldn't be allowed to go and lie on you when they get mad at you or you hurt them or they have an ulterior motive to destroy your life. That's wrong. Um, but a prosecutor's job is not to make sure you're innocent. A prosecutor's job is to make sure you're guilty. It's a defense attorney's job to make sure you're guilty. So sometimes you just got to sit back and let things play themselves out. and play and pray in the long run that the truth has a way of vindicating whoever deserves to be vindicated, because it's not about one side being right or wrong if two people are wrong. It's about who's right is the justified right and who's wrong is the unjustified wrong, if that makes sense. So, on behalf of Operation Rock and Clayton, because we're going on 40 minutes, I'd like to thank you for my listening to my brief presentation on the histories of your local police department. Stay tuned. At the end of the video, there was a Cash App. If you like, you can donate. We definitely appreciate it. Stay tuned. God bless, and stay and